One of the interesting things that we've come to realize is that the system of delivery is different than the system of transformation. So a lot of times in Agile, we define a system of delivery, and we think that we just train people on the system of delivery, and then everything's going to work. And what we've really realized, and I'm gonna just share some latest thinking, is that the end state model you're putting in is different than the mechanisms you're going to use to put it in. And I can't decide yet if I want to talk about change management is even a third thing. Okay, how do we bring people along? Yes. Okay, yeah. Well, hey, what's up, man? How's it going, Cassius? I know too many people in this room, so nothing. Don't throw anything at me, man. So okay, cool. So this is me. So Mike Cottmeyer, I run a company based out of Atlanta, so I drove up this morning. I live on the north side, so it's only like a 3-hour drive, called Leading Agile. We're about 100 people, and the largest transformation that we've run and are in the midst of running is about 13,000 people right now, okay? And it's a lot of people, right? And it's a lot of change, and it's a lot of change really fast. And what this talk basically is for us, it's the top most thin level of like, what's the big story of the kinds of things that you need to think about, right? So this kind of reflects our accumulated knowledge of the things that you need to take into consideration, okay? It's focused mostly on the system of transformation rather than the system of delivery. It's focused most upon change management rather than, whatever else it might end up being. Some of the questions that you guys were asking were largely around, how do I get my executives on board? How do I get my business partners on board? How do I overcome dependencies? How do I overcome resistance, right? That's all kind of implied up underneath there. The challenge that we have in Agile is that we have to talk about things that those people care about, right? So does anybody feel highly confident you know what your executives want out of your Agile transformation? Highly confident. Few. Anybody highly confident they understand what their business partners need out of the transformation? That's really telling, guys, right? So how do you guys expect to influence the people that you're trying to change if we don't even know what they care about? Okay? And so what the framework of this is about, it's about linking your transformation to the business drivers and things that your key stakeholders care about and figuring out how to get them to move. Okay? We tend to be idealists in the Agile community. We tend to say, look, we've got the religion. We know what this thing's supposed to look like, and it's all or nothing, right? We're going to go to the Holy Land, or we're not going to do anything, right? We're going to be purists, or we're not going to do anything. And what I'll assert for you guys here is that in a system of transformation, in a change management kind of environment, there are intermediate steps that have to be moved through in order to get people to go. We are not good as an Agile community at articulating what our intermediate steps are. Okay? And so one of the first things we talk about, right? So I'm going to give you guys kind of the big picture here. We kind of anchored on this idea. It started a little bit with Simon Sinek. Actually went into a consultant named Charlie Feld, kind of thinking through how to structure the story. And we kind of stabilized on this idea of why, what, how, and who. So we want to know why we're changing. What do people care about? What are the kinds of things that we're going to have to overcome? What are the impediments that are going to get in our way? Right? We have to create something that creates pull, to try to get people to come along. And we have to be really, really clear about the things that we want to change, what are going to be the barriers to change, what are we going to do while people are trying but they're not good at it. Right? All of those things are going to become the why of our transformation and our transformation strategy. Okay? And then we're going to have this set of stuff that I call what. It's like, what are we actually going to go do? One of the questions I like to ask people is, I said, if you were king for a day, you could change anything you wanted to change. You had all the money, all the support, you could hire the people, you could make people think something differently. Right? We're past evangelization. We're past getting them to think the right way. What do you want them to go do tomorrow? Right? Does anybody have a great idea if they could just overcome the resistance, what they would go do tomorrow? Right? I can't tell if you guys are shy or just, or just don't want to, engage, but it's like most people don't. Right? Because we get hit, with that resistance so much, we're way up here at the philosophy level rather than the what do I need to go do differently tomorrow level. And so in the what category, I talk about theory and approach, and I talk about reference architecture. Reference architecture is what are the underlying patterns of the organization that make it work. We get super dogmatic about Scrum or SAFe or large-scale Scrum or disciplined Agile delivery. What you'll find is when you look at all of those methodologies, they all have like stuff in common. They have patterns in common. And typically, it's not the specific instantiation of the methodology that matters. It's the underlying ecosystem that you create to make that methodology real. Okay? That's what I mean by reference architecture. So what are the fundamental non-negotiable patterns of agility that we need to pay attention to make the methodology relevant? Right? That's a big deal that often gets overlooked. Right? Just doing a daily stand-up meeting outside the context of a complete cross-functional team isn't incredibly meaningful from a delivery perspective. But within the context of a complete cross-functional team, it's a very powerful tool. Okay? So separating the behaviors and the things that we're asking people to do from the ecosystem and the fundamental system of delivery patterns that we care about is a really interesting thing to discuss. Oh, excuse me. And then as we get into, how are we going to explicitly manage change, right? How are we going to be able to say, especially when you're dealing with 13,000 people, which is, again, my largest at this point. When you're dealing with 13,000 people, you cannot flip that switch overnight. Even if you thought you could run 13,000 people through Scrum training, it's going to take you a couple years just to even do that. Okay, so what does it look like while you're getting there, right? How do you begin the process of building momentum? Okay, how do you measure results? Okay, not even specifically how do you measure results, but how do you measure results in a way that your executives and your business partners care about? Okay, team happiness is kind of incidental, guys, right? People being empowered is incidental, right? We know we're going to get that, right? That almost comes for free if we're able to do this. But the results people care about are flexibility in market, right? The ability to respond to change, the ability to make and meet commitments, the ability to stabilize throughput, right? All these different business metrics, escape defects, right? There's a lot of things that executives will really care about. And if you can demonstrate the ability to move those needles for them, they'll fund this stuff, right? And then last and not least, this is a little specific to us, but I think it's general enough that if we get there, I want to be able to talk about it a bit, is the idea of roles and responsibilities and skills and experiences. One of the biggest challenges that we have is that there are roles that need to be high influence, and then there's roles that are tactical and skills-based. And the mistakes we made the first year or two of being a consultancy, we're about 8 years old as a company, is that we would get really, really smart Agile people that were not great at having influence conversations with executives, right? The other side of that holds true. Really influential, smart systems thinkers, pattern recognition people, right, that can't do the execution on the ground, right? So for a while, we were looking for this holy grail of people that could do everything across the spectrum. So what we started to do is we'll talk a little bit about the business case and the business drivers, the things that I think are important from a transformation hypothesis perspective. Then we'll talk a little bit about the elements of theory and approach, the elements of reference architecture, the elements of a change model, how I would like you guys to think about this, the kinds of things we want to do to measure and manage results, and then all the skills and experiences and people stuff. This was an hour and 20-minute talk at Agile 2018. No way that I'm even going to get close to that in we probably have 30 minutes left. at this stage. So I'm going to introduce you guys to a lot of ideas. And then what we did is we created a paper associated with this. And again, we even did the paper because I thought an hour and 20 minutes was too little time, right? So we wrote about a 60-page paper around it. So you guys are welcome to download that. You don't have to give us any information or anything. You can just download it, right? There's no paywall in front of it, but we just like you guys to have the information. Okay, so business case. Most of the time when I talk to people about the goals of going Agile, we tend to focus on the human side of things, or we focus on building the right product, right, or responding to change, right? There's a lot of kind of keywords that we tend to focus on as a community. Let me give you guys some very specific language that I think resonates with executives when we're talking about creating business cases for going Agile. And the first one's predictability. This was like a big eye-opener for me because agility seems to imply speed, responding to change, adaptation, building the right product. That's not what most executives want as their top line. It's just not. Right? They'll talk about it, right? But they want our teams to be able to make and meet commitments, to be able to do what they say they're going to do. The next one, quality. We have to stop putting defective software into market. Early return on investment. We have to have the ability to put things in market sooner so that we can not only get feedback, but so we can start charging for them earlier, right? Start realizing and recognizing revenue. I mean, I'm kind of a new CEO, right? So like I said, about 100 people that work for me. If you don't make payroll in my line of business, you don't stay in business, right? So we want to do great things in market. But if we can't figure out how to get paid and manage cash flow and get, revenue coming in, we don't get the opportunity to do that. It's just the reality, right? And so the challenge is that if we can't figure out how to break investments up into smaller pieces and start charging for our software earlier, right, we don't get to stay in the game, right? And so that's a huge driver for these executives. Lower costs. Cost savings is tough, right? We know most organizations we walk into have 10 times more stuff to do than people to do it, right? So how in the world are you going to promise lower costs? Reality is you can't, but I'm telling you, your executives want it, right? So you have to have a story around it, right? And the story is that we are going to optimize for putting the most valuable features into market sooner. If we can cut some costs along the way, yeah, sure, we'll do that. And there are typically opportunities for that because organizations, while they are overloaded, they're often unbalanced. They have too many of certain kinds of skill sets. And they have too many of certain kinds of skill sets that don't readily transfer into other areas. Okay, so sometimes there's some short-term gain with lowering costs, but typically you could just take that cost savings and just apply it into building out the other parts of the organization. So I would never want to play this game based upon a cost savings play, but you absolutely need to understand and have an answer for that. The idea of innovation. Innovation is a real legit thing. Okay, so people do need to create systems that enable innovation. The challenge being is that the underlying ecosystem of the technology stack, the underlying ecosystem of the organizational design, the underlying ecosystem of the governance model absolutely tries to override everything we want to do from an innovation perspective. So you have two choices. You can either go create a separate organization and let it be innovative. People usually mess that up too, right? Or you've got to change the system of delivery within your company. Telling people to operate in a more innovative way is typically, you'll get micro innovation, but you won't get macro innovation as a large enterprise, okay? And then last but not least, product fit. Are we building the right things that our customers want and will pay us for? You notice how it keeps coming back to and will pay us for? Okay? If we can't tie back to economic drivers, then we don't get to stay in the game. It's visceral for us. When we first started, and I'm just being super transparent because I don't feel good, my voice is hoarse, so you guys are just going to get like super raw Mike Cottmeyer here right now. So when we first started, our average deal size was like $20,000, $40,000, something like that. We just signed a contract with our largest customer for about $8 million. When you do an $8 million contract with somebody, the CFO is paying attention. I don't care how big the company is. Right? And so if you can't figure out how to economically justify that spend, you're done, right? You don't get to stay, right? Now, for you guys, if you're a permanent employee someplace, okay, cool, right? Maybe you get to stay, but you don't necessarily keep doing the transformation, right? It's just the brutal reality of it, right? So the key to engaging executive stakeholders and the key to engaging the business is understand deeply what they want and tie everything you're doing back to their economic drivers. Period, right? And if you don't know the answer to that question, then you better go find out, because there's no other way to engage them. You guys make sense? Make sense? Okay, cool. Transformation hypothesis. This is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. So if anybody has ever read anything that I've done, I get super triggered by the idea of we just all run around here talking about culture, right? Culture is an interesting thing, right? So is culture the most important thing? Yes, probably. Okay, do I tend to de-emphasize it? Yes, probably. I'm kind of acknowledging that. Okay, but attacking culture it's like easy, right, in a way. It's easy and it's hard at the same time. So the pain that we experience when we want to do a transformation feels cultural because people resist change, right? So if we could just get people open to change, all our problems would go away, right? Well, no, right? Technology stacks, technology architecture, organizational design, process, governance, right, all that kind of stuff. So if we could somehow magically flip culture, what we're basically saying is that we hypothesize that we would be able to get agreement to do all the other things that we want to do. But a lot of times, there's real, legit barriers, right? Refactoring, a lot of banking in Charlotte, right? Right? Is somebody going to flip your mainframe that basically does billions of transactions a day? It's your total profit center around all your ACH processing and flip it into a services-oriented architecture overnight? Not going to happen, right? It's just not going to happen. It might happen over time, but it's not going to happen overnight. Okay? So there's real legit things that have to be dealt with, right? And so if you could even theoretically flip culture, which I don't believe you can overnight, then you have to immediately, as a fast follow, you have to change the system of delivery, and you have to change the operating model that system of delivery kind of operates within. So you change the structural context, and then you change the process context of the organization. And so what you guys have to understand is, what bet are you making with your internal stakeholders? Because if you bet on culture, first of all, you have a long road to hoe, because everything in your organization is incongruent with the cultural messages that you're trying to deliver. Okay? So you just know that you're introducing a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance into your enterprise. Okay? So at the point, let's say they even get past the cognitive dissonance. Now it's about delivery. Okay, so what do we need to do, and what investments do we need to make in that technology architecture and the organizational redesign and the process redesign, all that different stuff? What do we need to go do? Right? And so I would suggest that starting with culture is a dicey game. It's a dicey game. Okay? What we tend to do is we tend to focus on organizational design first. Okay, and we're going to go into that a little bit in the theory and approach stuff. If you've ever heard my 3 things talk, right? If you can't figure out how to create encapsulated teams that have a clear backlog that can produce a working tested increment of software at the end of a sprint, you're done. Right? Nothing in Agile is going to work. Right? What's interesting is that I can put people into that construct without changing their mind and make them more effective if I tie it back to business value. Right? So once you've anchored into the business drivers, you can demonstrate how a different organizational design will enable those business drivers. And you can put people into the right cultural or structural context. And then once you have the right structural context, you can enable that context with process that is actually congruent with the organizational design. Anybody have teams that aren't well formed? You have people matrixed across multiple Agile teams? Well, of course, right? You can't effectively do Agile in that context. Right? But if you put somebody in a complete cross-functional team, then you can teach them how to do Scrum, right? They can do Scrum and they'll deliver better with Scrum. And then you work on changing their hearts and minds, because at that point, the operating model that they're operating within is congruent with the cultural messages that you're trying to change. Okay? And so you're making a bet regardless of where you start. If you start with culture first, or if you start with practices first, or if you start with systems of delivery first, you're making a bet about how you're going to move those economic drivers. Here's the interesting thing. If you don't understand the economic drivers and you're running around saying culture, 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 Like, what is the value out of that investment? It's so disconnected, right? So disconnected, okay? And then, so you're making a bet, right? The other thing that I would suggest is that the size of the organization that you're engaging with really does matter. I mean, early on, we worked with 25 to about 150. A large engagement for us was about 250. Organizations those size have a class of problems, okay? Organizations that are 13,000, 20,000, right? They have a different class of problems to solve. And so the size of the organization is going to influence your transformation strategy. Don't have a ton of time to go into this slide, but you can grab the deck. Dependencies matter, right? Some of you guys talked about dependencies as I was asking you questions. The challenge with dependencies is that the dependencies reduce agility, period. I have like all kinds of fun anecdotes about my mother-in-law that I don't have time to go into. But if you guys pull a recording of this online, you'll hear some of the larger stories. But dependencies are going to reduce agility. So you have two choices. You either manage dependencies or you break dependencies, okay? In the presence of dependencies, most agile methods will not work effectively. So what you have to do in the presence of dependencies is have compensating controls. Because we're purists and those methodologies don't articulate the compensating controls, then what happens is we start installing Agile in the presence of dependencies, and we wonder why nothing works, right? Okay, and the reason is that Agile methods assume dependencies don't exist. Now, you could say, well, but SAFe has all these methodologies and things for like managing dependencies within the value stream. Well, what about when there's dependencies across value streams? What about when you're dealing with like a systems and platform layer that supports 10 products across your product line, right? And all of them are funneling work down into that shared services layer. How do you manage those dependencies, right? I don't think anybody's got a really viable answer. Okay, so you either manage dependencies or you break them, right? It's your only choice. Resistance is another thing, right? Resistance has to come into play. Most everybody at this point has a CIO that they're working for that says, yep, we're all on board, let's go do Agile. Okay, but do they really understand what it's going to take to do Agile? Do they understand the organizational design and governance and technology challenges that they're going to face? What about the middle managers that are under mandate to say that they have to do Agile, but yet they're scared to death that their job's going to change and they might not be employed at the end of it, right? So we have to figure out how to create safety for people, because they'll say that they support it because they have to, and then they'll do everything up underneath that to undermine it. Maybe not even intentionally, right? It's not because they're bad people, it's because they're scared, right? And we have to create safety for them, right? Probably a lot of you guys in the room right now. Okay, so theory and approach. So I'm going to just pop through some of this stuff a little bit quickly. But there's a concept that I talk about, it's called the three things. And what it basically comes down is teams, backlogs, working tested software. And so what I'm going to assert for you guys is that this is the fundamental non-negotiable pattern of an Agile enterprise. If you can't form whole, complete, cross-functional teams that are operating off of a clearly well-defined, articulated backlog that can produce an increment of working tested software at the end of a sprint that a customer can sign off on, something is broken. And you go, but Mike, I can't do that in my organization. How am I going to be successful with Agile in spite of this? And I would suggest that you're not. Okay? You might do Scrum. You might go through the motions of it. You might have Scrum Masters and product owners and do daily stand-ups and do sprint planning and release planning and burn down charts and reviews and retrospectives. You can run Scrum, or SAFe for that matter, perfectly and not achieve the goals that you want to achieve because you didn't have teams, backlogs, or working tested software. Period, right? And I challenge you guys, we don't have time today, but like I've sat in rooms and said, okay, let's talk, right? Give me an example where Scrum works in the absence of these three things. I would suggest that it doesn't, okay? The teams, backlogs, working tested software at scale gets expressed to me as structure, governance, and metrics, okay? So you think about what did SAFe, or less, or disciplined agile delivery add on top of Scrum? Because both they fundamentally have Scrum at the core, right? Right? So they all added in their own way a pattern of how to form teams at different levels of scale, different ways of interaction, different ways of managing process at scale, different ways of measuring and controlling. Okay? So the general pattern is structure, governance, and metrics. The specific pattern is something like SAFe or less or disciplined agile delivery. okay? But what I would suggest is that what we have to do is we have to be very intentional about how we're going to scale, especially in the presence of dependencies and coordination, okay? Because that's the trick. Dependencies are the root of this, okay? No matter how much process I teach you, in the presence of dependencies, you will have to create compensating controls to deal with those dependencies, period, okay? I'm being very direct, but I'm saying it with love. I just want you guys to know that, so. Okay, the next thing is that we started talking about is we have this thing we call the 4 quadrants. And it started off as I was blogging 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6 at this point, time flies. And I was like walking through how like different organizations value predictability versus adaptability, and different markets really value emerging requirements versus like anchoring in on very specific time, cost, and scope constraints. And what I was exploring at the time is how do I talk to different clients with different value systems and help them understand what we're going for, okay? And so what we kind of coined was this idea of 4 phases, or 4 quadrants. So we have the predictive emergent quadrant. And this was the one I didn't know if it existed at first, but think about this. High governance, high planning, high accountability, annual cycles, 18-month cycles, business cases, but like stuff's changing all the time. Right? Anybody live in that kind of world? Right? It's chaos. Okay, so now I just know that nobody wants to actually raise their hands because I bet you guys all live in this world. So, so this quadrant is the quadrant of chaos. It's the quadrant of heroics. It's the quadrant of irrationality, right? Because you can't deal with predictive planning in a world that's changing all the time. But that's where we find ourselves. Okay? The lower left quadrant is the idea of where the traditional stuff tends to live. You can do Agile in this quadrant, but it's a heavier form of Agile. Okay, it's more iterative and incremental, more team-based, right? That kind of a thing. But it's possible to do heavy planning against fixed constraints, but we deliver in iterations and we get fast feedback to manage optionality and to respond to change. Okay, it's not super light, probably too much overhead, probably too much waste. Often you get forced into this quadrant because of internal and external dependencies. Okay, even if you don't want to be in that quadrant, you get forced into that quadrant. And the lower right quadrant is where Agile tends to live as its home base, right? It's all about making and meeting commitments. It's just about making and meeting commitments in smaller batches. Okay? And then the upper right quadrant is more lean startup, right? It's more experimental. And so what's kind of fascinating is if you look at the family of methodologies, they all kind of have a home-based quadrant, okay? So a lot of times there's no right and wrong, it's just, where are you, okay? And then the next question you ask is, where do I want to go, okay? And then you say, what's in my way, right? If I can't form teams, I can't create backlogs, I can't produce working tested software, that's in my way. If I have to deal with dependencies, and I don't have a mechanism for dealing with that, that's in my way. If I can't, I don't have enough skill set or resource, whatever to get people onto the right teams, well, that's an impediment that's in my way, okay? And so one of the things I like to drive home with this slide is the idea that every methodology that's ever been created or a certification's been created worked for somebody at some point in time. It just did, right? But underneath every methodology was an organizational context that enabled that methodology. And the danger that we have in the certification stuff that's going on nowadays is that we're teaching people the methodology, but we're not sufficiently or adequately helping people understand what are the organizational attributes that have to be present for that methodology to work. And so what we assume is if I just teach you the methodology, you'll be able to apply it. What Scrum assumes is if you just apply Scrum, it will show you your impediments and you'll fix them. Until your impediments are a 50-year-old mainframe, right? That's not going anywhere right now. Okay, so what do? Right? Just getting real, right? Just getting real about that, right? So in the presence of an impediment, you have 2 choices. You either deal with the impediment, you break the dependency, or you create a management construct around it, right? Yeah, that's it, right? And so how do you get there, right? So I led this talk off talking about that transformation is a journey, okay? And so what we find more often than not is that the journey goes something like this, okay? We start off in the upper left in chaos, and we use this word called base camp. So I'm just going to talk about base camp 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So the idea is we take to base camp 1, and we stabilize the system in the presence of dependencies. And then we lean out the release process. We get things going into market faster. As we start to break dependencies, we can start to have the teams operate with more autonomy. As we get to a point where the teams are operating with autonomy, we can start to do team-based and product-based funding, right? Once we have all dependencies decoupled all across the entire stack, we can start to let those teams experiment more. Okay? So way beyond the scope of what I can go over here, but one of the things that I've had to do in order to not only build a company to do this, but to engage clients in a way that's in a healthy state, is that like each of these base camps have like a defined state, have a set of intermediate outcomes, have a set of activities, right, that have to happen along the way, right? And what the interesting thing is that if you want to be in base camp 5, you want to operate as a lean startup, there are a set of conditions in your organization that have to be created in order for the lean startup methodology to work. There are a set of conditions that have to be created for less to work, for safe to work, for Scrum to work, for XP to work, right? Any of that stuff. So transformation is about creating the conditions for whichever methodology you choose to work, overcoming the impediments to adoption, okay? And so the theory of transformation that we have is that fundamentally transformation is about being super focused on forming teams, building backlogs, producing working tested software, creating structures and governance and metrics at scale that support agility, and then systematically and progressively eliminating the organizational, technology, and process impediments that are going to inevitably get in your way, right? That's what it's about, okay? I don't see any other way, right? And by the way, when you tell the story this way, you can get people to write $8 million checks. Serious, right? You know, because here's the thing. So much of what our executives are hearing are, trust me, let's let everybody do Agile, and then the magic will happen. Right? And they can't connect the dots. You want to know why your architects in your organization are the most resistant to this? Because they live in the dependencies, right? They see them. And they have no idea how in the world doing a daily stand-up meeting is going to overcome this for them. And you know what? They're right. Right? They're right. Okay? So what it tends to look like, right, from a reference architecture perspective, and you guys will recognize this in SAFe, right? This is a SAFe pattern, this is a less pattern, this is a Scrum at scale pattern, right? It tends to be delivery teams at the bottom using Scrum, right? Some sort of coordinating entity at the program level, and some sort of coordinating entity at the portfolio level, right? So the delivery teams are responsible for execution. The program level team is responsible for decomposition, strategy to execution, right? Writing user stories, rolling stuff up, right? Measuring macro progress across multiple teams. And then the portfolio level stuff is really all about how do I make economic trade-offs in the face of scarce resources, okay? So there's nothing that you have to throw out in what I'm saying around the different tiers of the architecture. We tend to very explicitly manage the program and portfolio layers using more of a Kanban type method than like a release planning or PI type method. When we go into an organization that's using SAFe, that's at base camp 1 in the lower left quadrant because they've got dependencies, what we find is that backlog grooming is going to take way, way more than 2 days. It's actually a continuous process that's often done either by a cross-functional or dedicated group of people that are doing nothing but resolving dependencies, coordinating requirements, getting dependency-aware backlogs fed out to each of the teams. If you're doing SAFe, then what they're doing is they're doing that requirements grooming continuously, and then they're batching up a PI's worth, and they're bringing that PI's worth into the planning meeting. Okay? But this notional idea that you're supposed to do this in 4 hours or 8 or 16, it's nonsense. Right? Systems are way, way too complex. Okay? So now, remember, contextually I'm talking about base camp 1, base camp 2. If you've indeed broken the dependencies between teams or between value streams or between product areas or whatever, then SAFe out of the box is a more reasonable place to start. But in the presence of dependencies, in the presence of architectural concerns, more forward planning is required. But not waterfall, right? we're talking about reducing batch size, right? So we're talking about iterative and incremental requirements development. Okay, so metrics, right? Different metrics at different levels of the organization, right? So metrics down at the lowest level tend to be the kinds of things we think about. Velocity, escape defects, things like that. At the program and portfolio level, we tend to be more focused on flow-based metrics. What time am I supposed to stop? Is it 11:30 or 11:20? I think it's now. Okay, we'll get close. I'm tracking to 11:30, by the way, just so you know. Okay, so from a change model perspective, right, we use this language, we talk about expeditions. So we have expeditions, groups of teams moving to base camps. And so one of the things that we try to do is we try to figure out how to take this organizational structure and we try to break it into slices. And one of the things, 10 minutes? Okay, cool. So one of the things that we will attempt is to create a roadmap of slices of the organization and which base camps they're going to get to, what funding is required, and what outcomes will be achieved. Right? So is it unreasonable to put together an 18-month roadmap that articulates to your executives, here's the groups of teams that are going to go, here's the base camps they're going to hit, this is what you can expect for your spend, right? But we're going to do just like we would do in Agile, right? We're going to do 90-day planning, we're going to do sprint planning, we're going to measure progress, we're going to inspect and adapt as we learn new things, right? So one of the things that's really interesting is it's kind of in vogue at times to talk about using Scrum to introduce Scrum. But what we tend to do is to manage the Scrum backlog is like getting people trained, getting teams of Scrum Masters, getting, right? The unit of currency of a transformation is a transformed organization. Right? The unit of currency in a transformation is a better performing organization, right? So what we want to measure as we're doing this is how are the expeditions, how are they moving to base camps, what are the outcomes that we expect, and what is the raw economic performance gained as a result of doing this? And we would expect it to be marginal at the beginning and continuously improve as we move people through base camps. Right? One of the challenges we have is that typically by base camp 1 or base camp 2, it's good enough that people want to stop spending money. Right? That's not good for a consulting company. It's great for you guys, but it's not good for a consulting company, right? So I'm going to pop through some of this stuff and then go on to some other things. But you guys get the general idea. Okay, so results management. I'm just going to pop through. So what we like to do is we like to think about, right? So as we're measuring and communicating back to executives, we want to talk about capability improvement. Okay? How is the team's core skill sets improving? How are the activities that we're doing on a day-to-day basis rolling up into intermediate outcomes and moving expeditions into base camps? Okay? These are more progress type indicators. Progress type indicators are pretty valuable. Okay? But they're not everything, right? So we want to be able to put some dollars and numbers around predictability, cost to quality. Can we get things into market faster? What's the reduction in our cycle time, right? What's the reduction in our release size? How many releases are we able to put into a year? How many initiatives are we able to get through the system at the end of the year? How much cost have we been able to take out of the system? My CFO is responsible for this slide, so I can barely speak to any of it, but you guys will get the general gist. Right? Return on investment, payback period, capitalization rate, revenue acceleration, productivity enhancements, employee turnover ratio. These are the languages, this is the language of the executives that you guys are trying to get convinced to do this stuff. Okay? And then what the slide I actually want to get to, right, is, and this will be the point that we lead off on. We've over time realized that for us, dropping a knowledgeable Agile coach on the ground was insufficient. So we kind of came up with a hierarchy of roles. And really what it boils down to is what I was saying earlier. At the more senior level, the currency is influence. Getting people to change, getting people to move, creating space for a conversation. Right? Down at the other end of the spectrum, it's teaching people how to write user stories, how to do story point estimation, how to do a daily stand-up meeting, right? Incredibly different skill sets, okay? And so I just want you guys to be aware. And this is the slide I want to talk about for a minute, and then we'll put a bow on it and we'll get you guys out of here. So when we first started hiring Agile coaches, we would hire for what I call, it's in this 1.0, skills, experiences, right? Are you a good cultural fit for us? We didn't want to hire jerks, right? We're a small company. And are you active in the community? Okay, are you showing up? Are you running user groups? Are you, right? And that kind of a thing. And so what our hypothesis was, if you knew Agile, you had some experience, you were really active in the community, and you weren't a jerk, you come work for us. We We had a lot of great people come and go out of my company over that. I actually have more alumni of Leading Agile right now than I do permanent employees right this minute. Seriously, more people have passed through and exited than have stayed, because it's super difficult. And what people were doing is we were selling deals at this level and bringing in coaches at this level, and there was an impedance mismatch between them. And then we said, okay, well, let's stop doing that. So we came up with like what I call 2.0. A 2.0 is what I call beliefs and behaviors. And what you can find is that if you look at how people have been influenced over time and who they've been influenced, so like if somebody is like a big Lisa Atkins fan, Lisa's an awesome human being. She has a perspective on Agile and Agile transformation. It's a little different than mine, okay? Awesome person. If Lisa Atkins is somebody's home base, right, it gives you a little bit of a clue as to where they go, right? It tends to be very team-focused, very human-centric, very relationship-driven, right? All that kind of stuff, right? On the other end of the spectrum, you might consider like Dean Leffingwell and what Dean's done with SAFe. It's very business-focused, it's very enterprise-focused, it's more transactional, it's more process-oriented, but it's about trying to articulate a strategy for doing this stuff at scale. Now, the reality is that the truth's all over the place, but people's home base, if you're putting people, like if you know you have an executive that's very business, very enterprise, very scale focused, and you put somebody in front of them that's very human, relationship, whether that person is right or wrong, they will be rejected by that executive because they are not going to align with what that executive values. So you've got to get that executive to where you need them to be in a totally different way, okay? It'll work with some executives, won't work with all of them. And then we talked about behaviors. We use a tool called People DNA, and it's basically think like Myers-Briggs or DISC on steroids, but like we started measuring for like, do you get your feelings hurt? If you get your feelings hurt, do you get over it fast? You know, what's your response to getting your feelings hurt? Do you re-engage or do you go hide? Right? Things like that. And those are really interesting behaviors because, you know, some of us Agile coaches can be pretty sensitive, right? And so when an executive yells at us, we just go, okay, fine, and we just go do something else, right? What you've got to figure out how to do is you got to figure out how to pivot your story, right? You got to go back in and figure out how to map what you're doing to the value, right? So what we started really realizing is that certain behavioral profiles worked at different levels of the organization for us. And the stuff that an Agile coach, like a day-to-day in the team, especially like a developer Agile coach, right, was really different than the person you wanted to put in front of your C-level folks. Different skill set, different set of core attributes. And then we started getting into the idea of emotional intelligence and intellectual intelligence. And think about this. If I come into your office, Larry, and I am giving you my story, and you start fidgeting and getting uncomfortable and, you know, your body language is totally off, there's people in this world that can't read that, right? And they just keep going. Right? So if you can't pick up on the subtle cues of somebody who doesn't want to go into conflict but also doesn't agree, right, then you don't intellectually, or not intellectually is not the right word, you don't viscerally understand that you need to pivot. Right? What if you only know how to do Scrum? I got 1 minute, crap. What if you only know how to do Scrum? Right? So what we started to do was EQ and IQ. I need to be able to read that you're uncomfortable. I need to be smart enough to pivot into something else. Right? Then we started getting into this idea of pattern recognition and systems thinking. Okay? So go download the white paper, right? And you'll get a little bit more of a lengthy story around this. But what this is starting to become for us is, what is our system of transformation? What is our system of change management? And I'm just convinced as I can be that teaching people how to implement an operating model that is incongruent with their current reality does not get it moved. What it typically does is just frustrates people, right? So what we've got to do is we've got to get better at as a community of meeting people where they are, making some initial changes to systems and to processes in a small slice of the organization, and start to earn credibility to move the whole organization. And if you can do that in a very metrics, data-driven way that anchors back to what your executives and your product people actually want to see, I think you win, right? Okay, so good luck and thanks for coming to my talk. I appreciate it.